The topic this evening has to do with the idea, is there something metaphysical, is there something beyond the physical that remains after death? The topic this evening has to do with the idea, is there something metaphysical, is there something beyond the physical that remains after death? That's really the question. So it comes down to is whether or not in our lives, even as we live them now, is there something beyond the physical aspect of our existence? Or to state it more succinctly, does death merely mark the end of our body's participation in life? That's the real question. Is the death of the body, is our death merely the end of the body's participation of an ongoing concept of life? If in fact that is the case, then we are all now living part of an eternal existence. But this chapter happens to be dressed in a body. And that's the way the creator of the universe decided to put it together. We have a chapter now in our body, but there may be other chapters as well, which may not be physically oriented, or there may be chapters before or after. So with that approach, it really is an attempt to determine whether, I'll call it the mind, that part that might be beyond the physical, whether the mind is just part of the brain, or is the mind something separate that the brain accesses, that our access to the mind, for the mind to enter our body, it comes in via the brain. That's the question then. Is it possible that we have these two aspects, two parts of our existence, and that then the bottom line then comes out to be, is there evidence for the metaphysical in the physical? The metaphysical meaning not the philosophical concept. I went to a conference a year and a half ago on metaphysics, and it turned out, I didn't realize, but another use of the word metaphysics is philosophy. And there I happen to have a doctorate in philosophy, but it has nothing to do with philosophy. It has to do with science. And by metaphysical, I mean here above and outside the physical. There's an aspect in the world that implies that there is a metaphysical part of our world. The first part of this that would imply to be definitely the case is the fact that the universe has a creation, that there was a beginning to the universe. And the irony is that this was not always known. It should be very clear. The idea, most of the people, I look around the group this evening, and half of the persons this evening, just a quick glance, have grown up at a time when, or have had of the thinking about reality, that the idea that there was a creation of the universe is well known. And in fact, that isn't the case. The reality is that until very recently, like within the last 50 years, the overwhelming opinion of the scientific community was that the Bible is wrong from the first sentence, or theology is wrong, put it that way, from the first sentence, that there was no creation to the universe. There was a survey taken of scientists in 1959, in fact, late 1950s, 1959, republished in part in Scientific American about 9 years ago, in which hundreds of scientists in the US and Canada, North America, were asked aspects about the universe. Not the Earth, not the solar system, not our galaxy, the Milky Way, the whole kit and caboodle, the universe. And one of the key questions was, and the part that was republished in Scientific American was, what's your estimate of the age of the universe? And that was 1959. And in 1959, when asked the age of the universe, I know these open, there. In 1959, when asked the age of the universe, 2/3 of the scientists, when asked the age of the universe, said, age of the universe? You got to be kidding. The universe is eternal. There was no beginning to the universe. The Bible messed up from the very first sentence. That was 1959, less than 50 years ago. In 1965, the world had a revelation that changed the understanding of the world, and it is a hard pill, I'll put it that way, for the skeptic to swallow, that the overwhelming opinion of the universe was, very recently, there was no creation. Science has determined an eternal universe. And then in 1965, two scientists, wrong, it's white, put that away, that's the metaphysical, oh, that's perfect. Well, I mean, the fact that you can't see it has no meaning whatsoever. That's the metaphysical that we're talking about. So, thank you for having that. I've never thought of having, that's a brilliant idea. I'm seriously. In 1965, Two scientists at the Bell Labs in New Jersey, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, are about to win the Nobel Prize doing something that they didn't know what they were doing. They were studying communications, from satellite communications, using an antenna that hadn't been used for about 10 years, very deep dish antenna, like a horn. And it had been out in the labs, out in the field, out of doors, for about 10 years unused. They get the permission to use this, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson. They know nothing about cosmology, zero. They're totally into satellite communication, but instead of getting zero when they point at the black of the sky and not at a satellite, they get a static, a shh. And they couldn't understand what the static was all about because there's nothing out there. You know, space is empty. They analyzed it over dozens of measurements. First, they found out that the antenna was full of birds, because for 10 years it had been out of doors. They got rid of the birds. Shh. Static still remains. They checked the antenna. They forgot to get rid of all the droppings, the goo, you know, yuck, 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 yuck. They got rid of that mess. Shh. The static remained. They checked the antenna again, and guess what? What do pigeons always do? They came back to roost. So they say that they got rid of the pigeons definitively, which sounds like it was bad news for the pigeons. But for science, it was good news. Well, let's hope they just trapped them and sent them off to Washington, D.C. Because the static remained, and they analyzed the static and discovered that it was as if the entire universe was embedded in a sea of radiation of 3 degrees Kelvin. That's minus 270 degrees centigrade, minus 450 Fahrenheit. It's all the same, just different units. At 0 Kelvin, all molecular motion stops. Temperature is just another measure of how fast molecules are moving. So why does something hot burn your hand? Because the molecules are moving so fast, they don't slap your hand. Penzias and Wilson discovered that the entire universe is just a bit above absolute zero. And they couldn't understand what it was. In New Jersey, there's a university, Princeton, and Princeton, a Professor Peebles was writing a research grant asking for the wealth, the hundreds of thousands of dollars, to build this exact same satellite to study whether or not there was a creation, because Peebles, Professor Peebles, was a cosmologist and an astronomer, and he said that if these guys were right and the universe was eternal, space would be quiet. But if there had been a beginning, it would have started off hot and small, expanded out, and in the expansion, the temperature would have dropped and dropped and dropped, and Peebles predicted, totally predicted, without knowing anything about Penzias and Wilson's work. These guys are commercial at Bell Labs. Penzias and Wilson is academic. Peebles is academic. And Peebles predicted that if these guys were wrong, the radiation left over from the Big Bang would still pervade the universe, but as it expanded, the temperature would have dropped and dropped, and the temperature today would be somewhere between 2 degrees Kelvin and 5 degrees Kelvin. Totally theoretical. Penzias and Wilson had discovered the echo of the Big Bang. Overnight, the world learned that the metaphysical is part of the physical, because the creation of the universe means something extraordinary, which is a difficult, I don't say pill, but it's a difficult phenomenon for a skeptic to incorporate. Namely, that I happen to be looking at a person who considers himself a skeptic. Namely, the fact is that there was a beginning to the universe, and that beginning, with no equivocation, proves that the metaphysical interacts with the physical in a most fundamental way. That is to say, it produced existence. The question is, whatever this metaphysical is, you can call it God if you want to call God, it can be the laws of nature. You don't need a God to create the universe, but you do need something that is timeless, outside of time, because time begins with all understanding of physics today, which may be wrong, but the understanding we have today, time begins with the creation of the universe. So you need something that's timeless. The Bible defines it as God. A skeptic could say, well, you don't need God because, in fact, if the laws of nature, not nature, if the laws of nature are eternal, then they can produce a universe by a quantum fluctuation. So the atheist can say, thank God for that. Thank you. yeah, that's a very weak way of getting a joke, but that's the reality, because that's what the atheist must say. Thank God there could be the laws of nature. So the question then remains, does this metaphysical continue within the physical? Does it continue to interact? Can you draw it in? When we had this discussion a year and a half ago with this famous atheist, Anthony Flew, and he was affected by some of these arguments, the question was, when he became a deist, And more as we continue to study, we now know that something non-physical, I'm going to call it God, okay, produces the universe. And the question is this producer of the universe, this creator of the universe, interested in the universe beyond just creation? And so that you have to see how much you can draw this metaphysical in. And the fact that we have a non-physical producer of the universe implies strongly that there's a non-physical, that there is in fact this, I call it this metaphysical presence in the universe. The creation is still the major statement that demonstrates that, in fact, the non-physical can interact with the universe. The question, does it continue to interact? We know that the universe how we perceive the universe is vastly different from the reality. We know that there are things called virtual photons. Virtual photons are forces that carry energy, but they're not observable except in their effect. The simplest example was what Newton had, the idea of force at a distance. What keeps the moon circling the Earth? What keeps the Earth going around the sun? Well, we know it is gravity, which is no answer at all, just a tautology. Gravity is what makes the moon and go around the Earth. But what's carrying the force? So there's a theory about gravitons, these photons that carry this gravitational force. What we have here at the moment is something virtual. The best example on a physical level is something we measure in nuclear physics regularly. You have a center of an atom, a nucleus, and then an electron cloud. Positive nucleus, negative electron cloud. If you scaled up, if you wanted to study like visually, like Disney was going to show it, which is probably owned by Sony by now, that you scale the nucleus, the center of an atom, up to about the size of a grapefruit, orange or a grapefruit like that. Where would the electron cloud be? You have this electron cloud around this nucleus. It'd be 4 miles away. If the center of an atom, in a scale model, if the center of an atom were this size, the electron cloud would be 4 miles away. And there wouldn't be air in between. Air is what we're talking about, molecules. There'd be nothing in the fullest meaning of the word. So what keeps the electron cloud in orbit around the center? Well, we know what it is, virtual photons. Virtual photons are, they must exist, but they don't exist. But if they didn't exist, we'd all fly apart into nothingness. So there is this concept that we have this metaphysical reality, a reality that exists and yet is not observed. And that's in the physical world. Just to show that what seems to be solid, that ratio of an orange to 4 mile radius, an 8 mile diameter, is about 1 part in 10 to the 15th. 1 part in 10, well, 1 with 15 zeros after it. 1 part in 1,000 billion is positive. And everything else is absolute emptiness. So even the physical world plays tricks on us. And all because of these metaphysical photons that carry the forces. And what's coming out more and more in the studies of nuclear physics, astronomy, and quantum physics is brought down very well by the late knighted mathematician Sir James Jeans. He's a scientist that essentially developed the understanding of how stars evolve, elements, etc. And here's in a book published by the Cambridge University Press a bit over 70 years ago, The Mysterious Universe. There's a wide measure of agreement, which on the physical side of science approaches almost unanimity, that the stream of knowledge is heading towards a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. In a commentary on the Bible called the Talmud, written down in about 1,400 years ago, about 1,500 years ago, about the year 1400 or so, we're told that the universe is essentially an expression of the thought of God. We are an expression of the thought of God, and that's exactly what James Jeans says in this understanding of the world. To anchor it onto the Bible, are there any hints of this? Are there any? Pardon me for. I always say I wear a jacket twice a year when I come to the United States. The understanding then, is there anything present in the Bible that gives us the same idea that there might be something metaphysical? And then to lead for that, because I'm trying to work towards an understanding, again, that the mind is separate from the brain. In every death that is described in detail, in the Bible, there's an interesting sequence. And with Joseph burying his father, Jacob, it's most dramatic. Joseph is now, there's the famine in Egypt. Joseph tells the Pharaoh how to save Egypt from the famine. Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt. The famine is so strong that Joseph's family, Jacob his father, and the tribes come down to Egypt to stay there. Jacob lives after the famine ends. Jacob lives for another 15 years or so in Egypt. And then Jacob dies while he's in Egypt. He gives his children an ethical will. He tells them what he thinks of them, in no uncertain terms. And then the text reads like this, and it's directly from the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, chapter 49 and chapter 50. And when Jacob had completed commanding his children, he gathered his feet to the bed and expired, died. And he was gathered to his people. Then he was embalmed, and the 40 days were fulfilled, because such is the time for embalming. Then he was mourned for 70 days, and then his son carried him to the land of Canaan from Egypt, where he died. And they buried in the cave of the Machpelah in Hebron, which Abraham had purchased. So there's something that's out of sequence here. Jacob dies, is gathered to his people, is embalmed, is mourned for 70 days, is carried from Egypt to Hebron, which is a short distance out of Jerusalem, and then is buried. So if gathered to his people clearly cannot mean being the burial. In other words, not taking his body or his bones being put into a cave where other ancestors have been buried. So what's the gathered to his people? The gathered to his people must be something quite different. In fact, it must be something along the idea that there might be a spirituality involved here that does not reflect the physical death, but takes place long before the actual burial. And this would be the aspect of a spiritual idea. And what we see a parallel of what this might be is, in fact, the idea of the near-death experiences. When you hear about near-death experiences individually, they're anecdotal. A person dies, is clinically dead, comes back to life and tells of the experience that he had while he or she was clinically dead. Each one is anecdotal. But several years ago, one of the leading medical journals in England, called Lancet, peer-reviewed journal Lancet, had 2 articles. I have just one of them here today. Near-death experience in survivors of cardiac arrest, a prospective study in the Netherlands. And this study went to understand many, many cases. In fact, they studied 344 consecutive cardiac patients that had died and were successfully resuscitated. And all of those took place in hospitals. And it was a very rigorous study, and hence it passed peer review in Lancet. The study was such that if a hospital refused to give any one of the cases, like maybe they had 50 people that had been resuscitated, but one of them they wouldn't show, who knows, legal reasons, whatever, that hospital was dropped entirely. So there's no skewing of the data by having them give you this piece of information but not piece of information. About 20% of the persons that had near-death experience, that had died, had near-death experiences. And the experience is always quite similar, this idea of a light, meeting dead relatives. They acknowledge in this many pages of scientific discussion that you can stimulate the brain to get some feeling of wonder, some ecstasy. We know that happens either electrically in neurosurgery, or also pilots that undergo high Gs when they're diving and then pulling out of the dive can have this also. But those experiences are always fragmented, whereas the near-death experiences were consistent in showing a flow of information and always accompanied by this concept of unconditional love. It's interesting, this idea of unconditional love. So I mentioned something on the Dennis Prager show this morning, that if one of the messages of the Bible, if in fact the Bible or theology is telling us a true story of the world, the message of Eden, of the Garden of Eden, is love. That's what the message is about. That we happen to have messed up and got kicked out of Eden is a different story. But the message of man, even if it's a metaphor, it's immaterial, literal or metaphor, doesn't matter. The message is clear. The biblical understanding of the world is created for love. That's why Eden was the most perfect of all places, considered the most perfect of places. So having gone through this understanding of studying these 344 cases, they reached the peer-reviewed conclusion as followed. And I say peer-reviewed to make it clear that other doctors that are not involved in this work accept the conclusion. Whether it's true or not is speculative because they don't give an actual answer, but they write the following. The thus far assumed but never proven concept that consciousness is located in the brain should be discussed. That consciousness, the thus far assumed but never proven concept, that consciousness, our awareness of ourselves, self-awareness, sentience, is located in the brain, should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death with flat EEG? Near-death experience pushes the limits of medical ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relationship. Finally, the theory and background of transcendence should be included as part of the explanatory framework for the experiences of near-death experience. Transcendence, of course, means something very clear, that there's something that goes beyond the dead body. Because the difficulty is when it's all flat and there's no measurable brain activity, is something taking place or not. And one of these talks, this is the first time I've talked on this in the States, but in Israel, about a year ago, so I was giving a lecture, a discussion in the Old City, and after the talk, Dr. Michael Chestnut, I use his name, of the Long Beach Medical Center near New York, comes up and said, I got to tell you, we had the exact experience. I said to him, why didn't you say it during the talk? That's more important, so people can hear that it's just not me speaking. And a person was undergoing an angiogram. The man flatlines, dies on the table, on the medical table. I think that Chestnut was the anesthesiologist, but I'm not sure. The man flatlines on the table, his EEG, and no brain activity. Has a near-death experience. He comes back and he tells the doctor not just what was happening in the room where the operation was taking place, but in the room next to it where the door was closed to. And Chestnut says there's no way he could have understood it. That I mentioned his name deliberately because you can actually speak with a person and verify that such a reality occurred. They bring one anecdotal experience, which is worth looking at because it's so typical of the experience of near-death. During a pilot phase in one of the hospitals, a coronary care unit nurse reports a out-of-body experience. The person is brought in completely blue. On the night shift, an ambulance brings in a 44-year-old comatose man into the coronary care unit. He'd been found in about an hour before this in a meadow by passers-by. After admission, he receives artificial respiration without intubation, while heart massage and defibrillation are applied. When we want to intubate the patient, it turns out he has dentures in his mouth. I remove the upper dentures and put them in the crash car. That's the one with the bottles on it, the drawer. Put them in the crash car. Meanwhile, we continue extensive CPR. After about an hour and a half, the patient has sufficient heart rhythm and blood pressure that he's still ventilated and intubated and still comatose. He's transferred to the intensive care unit to continue his necessary artificial respiration. Only after about a week or more do I meet him again with the patient, who is by now back in the cardiac ward. I distribute his medication. The moment he sees me, he says, oh yeah, that's the nurse. She's the one, don't you remember? She knows where my dentures are. I'm very astounded. And he elucidates, yeah, don't you remember you took them out of my mouth when I was brought in, and you took my dentures and you put them in that drawer. You know the drawer in the cart that moves around, it's the bottles on the top and the sliding drawer. That's where you put them. And that's where my teeth should be. I was especially amazed because I remember this happening while the man was in deep coma and in the process of CPR. When I asked him further, it appeared that the man had seen himself lying on the bed, that he perceived from above the nurses and doctors that were busy with CPR. He was also able to describe correctly and in detail the small room where he had been resuscitated, as well as the appearance of those such as myself who were present. At the time he observed the situation, he'd been very much afraid that we would stop CPR and that he would die. It is true that we were highly negative about his, not surprised he'd been dead for over an hour and a half, about his poor condition when he was admitted. The patient tells me that he desperately and unsuccessfully tried to make it clear that he was still very much alive. We should continue CPR. He was deeply impressed by the experience and says he's no longer afraid of death. 4 weeks later, he left a healthy person. I was deeply impressed by it, I would imagine. But the single event is anecdotal. The study of 344 is no longer anecdotal. It becomes able to pass peer review. The fact is there are these ideas that there's something that goes on in awareness of the body that exists when there's flatline. We're all aware of how our bodies are. The brain has enough. We have 5 maps of our body in the brain. It's interesting, if you wiggle your toes. You ever feel your toes wiggling? But where are you feeling your toes wiggled? Not in your toes. Toes don't feel a thing. You feel in the brain, but the projection is that it's down in your toes. That's why the phantom limb, when God forbid a person has a limb removed, they can still feel the limb as if it were there until the brain rewires that part. You don't feel anything in your toes, even though you're sure you're feeling the wiggle in your toe and your feet. It's all up here. The fact is, every one of you sitting here right now, close your eyes and you can picture your body completely, because all those maps are there which know where your body is. So you could say, well, these out-of-body experiences are merely revamping that piece of information. But what about the other bodies that are in the room? In other words, what about the other things that are going on in the room? If you're flatlined, the brain doesn't seem to be recording it. But for somehow, it does seem to be recording it in some aspect of your existence that may not be, and then that's the argument aiming for, that may not be part of the brain. Is the mind, I'll call it the mind, the part that some people might call it the soul, the part of you that outlives your body. The brain is magnificent for calculation, and computers are also. That's why they're called computers. The brain takes information in, stores it, analyzes it, and that's all the input. The question is, though, what about the output? If you think about the famous battle that took place about 10 years ago with Garry Kasparov and the IBM computer Deep Blue, and Deep Blue the computer beat Kasparov in that 3-4 match, and at the end, Garry, in the newspaper interview, said after that final match, he said he wasn't much good for anything. He said he was facing a new type of intelligence. That was his experience during this match. I'm facing a new type of intelligence, which he was. It was an intelligence without any emotions. When the match was over, Garry, probably needed a cold shower and a day's rest. The computer just goes by and stands by and says, "Bring on the next victim." Because what you want for chess is exactly what the computer has and not what we've got. You don't want emotions when you're playing chess. You want pure calculation. And the computer does that wonderfully, and our brain does it also. But somehow there's this analysis of the information that comes back as motion. A question would be, where is this feedback? The information going into our body is known to within 100%. I talk to you, I make motions with my vocal cords, and some of the situations are extraordinary, the subtlety. The difference between a P and a B is whether your lips open before or after within, I think it's 5/1000ths of a second. That's the timing. Whether your lips open before or after your vocal cords start the information coming out. Whether you're going to say, "I want a pill" or "I want a bill," is that in that 5/1000th of a second of how you relate your lips to the vocal cords. So the timing is extraordinary. We know how the information comes out. Vocal cords vibrate, air vibrates, it comes to your eardrum, the eardrum moves, there are 3 little bones, they move also, they move an inner eardrum, the inner eardrum moves a liquid in the canal, the hairs move, at the base of the hair there's bioelectric signals that then go to your brain, and then you hear sound. But the brain doesn't hear any sound. There's no sound in your brain. Or there's gurgle, gurgle, gurgle when the blood goes through the veins. There's no sound. So we're hearing the sound. There's no sound in your brain. Any doctor in this room will tell you that. Put a microstethoscope anywhere in the brain and you will hear no sound whatsoever. Because there is no sound in your brain. There's biochemistry. And the identical biochemistry that produces sound produces vision, but that's because the nerves go to the other part. And there's a rare but well-studied disease where, unfortunately, in the fetal development, the wiring gets crossed and you hear sight and you see sound, not coherently, obviously, because it's the same chemistry, it's just different parts of the brain. So where's the sound? Forget the vision, it's sound. We know there's no sound in your brain. We know that the biochemistry, when I say with the scientific community, so the biochemistry is known to within a fraction of a millimeter, where nouns are stored, where harmony is stored, where verbs are stored, where numbers are stored. That's all known. But that's chemistry. That isn't sound. So the cop-out answer is, well, that's how we reinterpret the chemistry. Obviously, that's not even an answer. It's a tautology. Of course, that's the whole aspect of it. But where's the interpretation? Where's it taking place? Do we hear sound in our brain, or do we hear sound in our mind? Do we feel the emotions in our brain? We know the brain stores that information. But where's the emotional replay? Where does the replay take place? And the idea that this might be known by those who are actively involved in this neurology is a fantasy, because when you talk about persons that have to put the information on the line and state in writing, because it's always useful to write things down, to state in writing what the understanding of the mind-brain interface, it's worth making a few quotes, especially from Scientific American. I use Scientific American because Scientific American is an avidly materialist journal. In fact, every month they have a column, a sponsored column, called The Skeptic, in which we learn that everything non-materialist is fantasy, and hence the name. Mike Schwirmer, who is the head of the Skeptic Society in the United States, is the person who was hired by Scientific American to write this column. So that fixes the picture of the editorial outlook of Scientific American. A few years ago, they commissioned Robert Sapolsky, professor of bioscience and neurology, Stanford University, to write an article about the brain. And it's about a 5 or 8 page article. He makes a summary statement. Despite zillions of us neurologists slaving away at the subject, we still don't know squat about how the brain works. See, there's no sound in your brain. We still don't know squat how the brain works. Another scientist who is avidly atheist/agnostic, John Maddox, was the former editor of Nature. And when editors have this slant in their life, then you can rest assured the type of information that gets into the journal is skewed towards that approach, because when you're editor-in-chief, then you decide what gets and what doesn't get published. So John Maddox, to give him a picture of his approach to the world, Maddox in August of 1989, wrote an editorial in the journal Nature, which is one of the 2 leading peer-reviewed general scientific journals in the world. The Big Bang, this is Maddox, the Big Bang is philosophically unacceptable. It is a theory that will be gone in 10 years. The Big Bang is philosophically unacceptable. It is a theory that will be gone in 10 years. That was 1989, approximately 18 years ago. Maddox was wrong. The Big Bang, according to NASA, most of you can't see that, but this is from the web, this is the model of the universe. The Big Bang creation of the universe, time flows here, the universe expands. The understanding of the world is there was a creation to the world. Maddox writes about the concept of consciousness. Nobody understands how decisions are made or how imagination is set free. What consciousness consists of or how it should be defined is equally puzzling. Despite the marvelous success of neuroscience of the 20th century, we seem as far from understanding the cognitive process as we were a century ago. What it means is that we don't understand self-consciousness. What is the origin of consciousness? Where is it? If it is part of the brain, it is very, very well hidden. The idea that consciousness might be emergent, that there might be something emergent in the world, doesn't contradict our understanding of the world. We know there are emergent forces in the world. The one example was you have a positive electron here, a positive proton here, a negative electron here. They exchange forces, but the positive charge of the proton is not using up the proton, or the proton would eventually evaporate and go away. The positive charge is caused by the proton, but not of the proton. The negative charge of the electron is caused by the electron, but it's not using up the electron. The electron isn't spewing off something physical. It's totally emergent. So the idea of emergence is completely accepted in the world today. The idea that there is something non-physical acting in the world, it is so totally accepted that in fact the reality is we are essentially made solid, as we feel solid, by these emergent virtual forces. And it comes back again to the replay. We know from our brain the information coming back, but how we experience that, or how we experience that is quite different from what goes in. Because chemistry goes in, but we don't have chemistry coming back. We have sound coming back. Can the analogy be a radio and the radio waves? If the brain is like the radio and the radio waves are out there, so all the time that the radio is functioning, we can hear the music. We don't see the music in here. We just had a cell phone ring. The room is full of radiations. We don't see them because we're not cell phones. We don't pick them up. We need a cell phone to translate that radiation to us. We pick up radiation we see as light or noise, physical impact on our ear. If the brain is like a radio and our mind are like the radio waves, then when the radio is smashed and doesn't work any longer, the radio waves remain. They're not affected by the lack of the radio. Only thing is the radio can't experience them any longer because it's broken. Our brain may be the only antenna that can pick up the mind. And each mind is more or less tunes for the antenna that the brain represents. And persons that can read other person's mind, if they really can, then would be able to cross-tune on this. And there's enough information in the world that would imply that in some level, with the proper technology, it may be possible, in fact, to cross-tune, so you could pick up other minds. Now that's speculative, but there's a lot of work that goes on with that at different parts of Homeland Security at the moment. So the brain is there, picking up the mind. This idea of a mind-brain being separate is not isolated from our understanding. James Jeans talked about this idea of being a thought. I think it's worth just quoting a few other persons. Nobel laureate Werner Heisenberg earns the Nobel Prize for developing some of the fundamental theories of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is not esoteric. Quantum mechanics and the physics that evolves from quantum mechanics, which is totally illogical, but measurable. Quantum mechanics is totally illogical. Unlike the laws of relativity, which were derived by logic and then proven to be the case. Einstein derives this idea of the relativity of time, the bending of space, etc. These laws of relativity. That from a few simple cases can be shown, once they're shown to you, to be logical. Quantum mechanics is totally illogical, and yet it works. You press the button on your remote control and the television goes on. You press the button on your remote control, the car doors open or the car door locks. Something is happening, but the electronic reactions that allow transistors to work and the other things that are the fundamentals of the electronic industry today require that these electrons actually leave the physical world and then appear on the other side of a barrier, a potential barrier, in a time less than it would take to cross the barrier. They couldn't cross it anyway, except because of the barrier being present. So it's as if they go into another dimension. It's as if these electrons enter another dimension and then re-enter our world here, essentially simultaneously, moving physically from one space to another in essentially zero time, which would of course require leaving our physical world of time, space, and matter, and then re-entering it at a different space-time coordinate system. And that's the reason that you can open your car door by remote control. In other words, quantum mechanics is not something on the shelf, isn't nice and esoteric, but it has no reality. The fact is, all of electronics today is based on this, including why this microphone is working at the moment. Heisenberg earns the Nobel Prize for developing some of these thoughts. In a book called Physics and Beyond, inherent difficulties of the materialist theory of existence have appeared very clearly in the development of 20th century physics. This difficulty relates to the question of whether the smallest units of matter, such as atoms, of which all objects are composed, are ordinary physical objects. Do atoms exist the same way as stones and flowers? Here, quantum theory has created a complete change in the situation. The smallest units of matter are, in fact, not physical objects in the ordinary sense. They are, in Plato's sense, ideas. The fact is, matter appears to be more of an idea than a physical reality. Schrödinger, Schroeder, we dropped the ing. Erwin Schrödinger, Nobel Prize laureate, the same period as Heisenberg. So in brief, we do not belong to this material world that science constructs for us. We, the awareness of our being ourselves, are not part of it. We're really outside. We're only spectators. The reason why we think we're in this physical world is that our bodies are in the picture, and this is the only way of our mind communicating with them, as if the mind-body were separate. I had an email from a person who I never met him, and he said his father, who is an absolute atheist, agnostic, probably more agnostic than atheist, but his father died and was brought back to life, and he said this had this most strange experience. The father said he was looking at his body, and then saw things happening, came back to life. But notice the sequence. His body's not him. He's looking at his body, as if he's looking at an old overcoat. In fact, that was the description. Who wants to get back into that? The he wasn't the body. The he wasn't this stuff. The he was something totally separate. And the only aspect we have to that is either, I guess, if you could put a person to a trance, which I have no idea about, or these understandings where the few times that persons have, in fact, come back from the, how should you say it, from the great beyond, from the death. So what would be the flow that would have NASA produce this flow here? What we have here is, this is nothing. You call it God or the laws of nature. This is the creation, and time goes forward. These lines, most of you can't see, but these lines are billions of years. The specks here are galaxies. The universe starts as a speck of energy, and that's the only creation. We talked about it with Dennis on the Prager show this morning. This is the only, everyone holds by this. You can be a raving atheist, you can be a raving, in Hebrew say Haredi. You can be a raving atheist that thinks religion is evil and theology is stupid, or you can be a raving theologian that thinks God is present in every molecule, which is probably true. And from the entire scale of raving, from raving atheist to raving theologian, everyone holds by this reality. The Big Bang produced all the matter that will ever exist, and it didn't enter the universe as molecules and atoms. It entered the universe as energy, light beams. I call it light beams just to be able to wrap our mind around it. The Big Bang enters the universe as pure energy. And so you have this amazing flow. You have a flow where the universe starts off as energy, and then from Einstein's famous equation equals mc squared, we see that matter and energy are interchangeable, that the energy can condense into matter. Now, when you hear that argument, one of the mistakes is to think that the energy disappears and the matter is totally different, but that isn't what the equation said. This equation does not say that the matter disappears. It says that the matter, that solid matter, is a manifestation, an expression of energy. It remains energy, just like water. You pick up a glass of water to have a drink of water. And what are you drinking? What's water made of? Anybody know? Hydrogen, oxygen. But not many people on a hot day say, wow, I mean, it is really hot here today. I mean, it is hot today. And you know what I'm going to have right now? Some hydrogen and oxygen. You can't beat hydrogen and oxygen on a hot day. Glug, 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 glug. Now you see drinking water. It's still hydrogen and oxygen, just in a different form. See, this didn't stop being energy. It just changed form. It remains the light beams of creation, as does everything you see around you. And the matter then in the stars becomes heavier elements, and then through metamorphosis, you get life. And then the life eventually develops a brain, and out of the brain comes a mind. I make it a squiggly line here because we're not really sure, but this for certain here, this part of the equation is the physical world. But when you think about this, it's a major problem that it raises, and the major problem that it raises is how do energy beams become alive? How do light beams become alive for your joy? Because that's what happens, and you can be Richard Dawkins, you can be the ultimate skeptic in the world, and you still are stuck with the fact the Big Bang produced light beams, and out of those light beams became a brain. And yet there's no hint in the protons and the neutrons and electrons that make up the atoms, and there's no hint in the atoms that make up the molecules, or in the molecules that eventually are going to get cognizance, self-awareness. Light beams become self-aware. That's what happened. It's a big stretch, but that's what happened. And it's not New Age. It's not like New Age fantasy. The Big Bang produced one thing and one thing only, and NASA describes it right here. You can take this down from the web. Just Google up NASA, WMAP, and you can have that as your screensaver if you want. There it is. The W map, the Wilkinson Observatory map. And what this diagram shows, which is hard to see, but that light beams became so intelligent that they could produce a satellite that could make this take place. The two scientists that get the Nobel Prize, not for this map, but for giving the background that led to this map, George Smoot at UC Berkeley and John Mather at NASA, get the Nobel Prize for leading to the data that finally allowed the much more complex piece of instrumentation to make this map. The Big Bang produces one thing, and it is accepted reality. But how? How can it be that you get cognizance out of light beams? Because that's a reality that if you argue any or discuss any other aspect of existence of the metaphysical, something totally ethereal, energy that fills this room, learned how to feel love, joy, boredom, excitement. How? How does it happen? Because certain combinations, I mean, really, they still, like the water remains hydrogen and oxygen, the combinations remain what they're made of. Light beams, energy. And the question then spins out of this, is this possible? The fact is, science, when we think about Schrödinger and Heisenberg and James Jeans, the ideas of thought and idea, all these things are pointing towards a reality that may be based on something very different from this. This may be a description of the physical world, but maybe there's something that precedes it or goes beyond this. Is it possible that there's something that is deeper than this? John Archibald Wheeler, whose accolades in physics go, like they take a page to say them, so I won't bother saying them, wrote like this: "To my mind, at the bottom of it all," this is a man who was formerly the head of the American Physical Society, the head of the society the umbrella for all physicists in the United States. "To my mind, at the bottom of it all, there must not be an ultimately simple equation, but an utterly simple idea. And to me, that idea, when we finally discover it, will be so compelling, so inevitable, and so beautiful that we'll say to each other, how could it ever have been otherwise?" The difficulty that spins out of this is, how could this take place? And that answer is couched within the opening sentence of the Bible. And that opening sentence of the Bible has a meaning that unfortunately has been so highly perverted by the Greek translation of the Hebrew into English. Approximately 2,200 years ago, the Bible was translated by 70 or 72 scholars from Hebrew into Greek. There are a lot of traditions that go, it's called the Septuagint, or the Septuagint, depending how you pronounce it. And the Septuagint was the Hebrew into Greek. Then the Greek was into Latin and about the Vulgate, St. Jerome the Vulgate, about the year 350. And then in 1611, King James had the Latin translated into the English when he's breaking from the Catholic Church. But always the Greek translation formed the basis of these other translations. And it was known at the time that there were deliberate mistranslations put into the Greek. That's a given. There's no question about that. For instance, the opening sentence of the Bible says that God created the heavens and the earth, but the Greek says God made the heavens and the earth. Greek has a word for creation, but they don't say that because to make the Bible Greek-friendly, the fact is that I'm talking about ancient Greek philosophy, not modern Greece, that the Greeks held that nature was eternal and the gods were eternal. With nature being eternal, the gods used this clay of nature to make the world. In other words, there wasn't a creation of the world, it was a making. There's a big difference between creation and making. That's just one of the examples. But the major mistake was in the opening word, Bereshit. We usually in English, I don't know how it is in Farsi, so I apologize, I don't know the translation. But I do know it in English. And every English translation says, in the beginning God created the heavens and earth, or with the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, or in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth. Always the word beginning. That's the Greek mistranslation. The text never said in the beginning. It never meant in the beginning. And the reason I come down hard on this now is because it tells us exactly how this emerges from this. This is the physical world. This is the physical world. Over here we have something called God. I just write some Hebrew letters here for the four-letter name of God, but misspelled deliberately. Here we have God, the creation, or if you want it, the laws of nature, whatever you want to call this. What does Breshit mean? Breshit, in the simplest translation, means in the beginning of. That if the text was in the beginning, it would be Breshonah, the Hebrew. It's important. Breshit bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The aspect of God is manifest in nature, as Elokim is. In Genesis chapter 1, for those who don't know the Hebrew, the only name for God is manifest in nature. Genesis chapter 2 and therefore has the other name for God and the original game, the names that bring the two aspects together. Breshit does not mean in the beginning, because if you read the simple reading of the text, it would say, in the beginning of, God created the heavens and the earth. Get a problem here? The beginning of what? Of requires an object. King James just drops the of as the Greek did, but that's in the Greek, but we can do the English. But I drop because why? It's only God's word, so I just drop the of. The fact is, Breshit never meant in the beginning, it never implied in the beginning, and the oldest commentaries that we have say you can't, the oldest commentaries before the English that argue against the Latin and the Greek say the in the beginning is wrong, even though it's imprinted on our brain, and everyone will walk out of here that speaks English tonight, and only English, will say it still means the beginning, because the song a sparrow learns in its youth is its song for life, and humans are no different. You get programmed, it's in the beginning, then it's in the beginning. The word is Breshit, with something called Reshit, with a first cause. God created the heavens and the earth. And that first cause consistently through all the ancient commentaries, long before quantum mechanics, long before Heisenberg, in the year 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and 2,500 years ago, is that word Reshit is translated as wisdom. That God uses something totally not physical to create the world. That the first creation of the world is wisdom. And that wisdom, which is totally metaphysical, produces the universe and manifests itself as physical. And the question, when Heisenberg, they call it an idea or a thought, or the most extraordinary explanation is, and I'm going to wrap it up very rapidly now, is by Nobel laureate George Wald. Wald is a biologist, and therefore it's important to him, because Wald deals with the brain. Wald is the man that discovered what we take for granted, that I look over here and I see you, and I look over here and as fast as I can turn my head I see you and I don't see you. How? How can it be that we have, when the first atomic bomb I saw detonated, we had on a tripod, we had a camera that shot 1,000 frames a second. We wanted to see ground motion very clearly. You can't see 1,000 frames a second in a second. And that camera was shooting 1,000 frames a second. It was a mechanical wonder. We don't have 1,000 frames, we have one frame. It's called the retina, the back of our eyes. And yet as fast as I can turn my head, I see you, and now I don't see you, and I see you. And Wald discovered and earns the Nobel Prize for how that happens like that, because we just take it for granted. Imagine if it took a second to make that transition. You'd have to walk very slowly. Wald earns the Nobel Prize, and it changes him from an absolute agnostic. You read his earlier writing, it is 100% agnostic, to a person that sees the world very differently. And in 1984, in the midst of his career, after earning the Nobel Prize, in which he has to face his colleagues the next day, he doesn't go to some mountaintop and hibernate for the next 20 years of his life, he writes like this, in an article called Life and Mind in the Universe, in the peer-reviewed International Journal of Quantum Chemistry, Quantum Biology Symposium number 11, 1984. It has occurred to me lately, and I must confess with some shock at first to my scientific sensibilities. It has occurred to me lately, and I must confess with some shock at first to my scientific sensibilities, that both the questions of the consciousness in humans, the origin of consciousness in humans, and the origin of life from non-living matter might be brought into some degree of congruence. This is with the assumption that mind, rather than emerging as a late outgrowth in the evolution of life, has always existed as the matrix, the source, and the condition of physical reality. The stuff of which physical reality is composed is mind stuff. It is mind that has composed the physical universe that breeds life, and so eventually evolves creatures that no one can create, the arts, sciences, and technology. See, when these scientists, the fact that they say it doesn't make it true, but when you have noble scientists telling idea, thought, and mind, and the Bible, 3,300 years ago, telling us wisdom, these are not two sides of the same coin. These are the same side of the same coin. The fact is, the universe is the expression of a wisdom. It is a great stretch to think how light beams could become alive. It's only a slightly greater stretch to think how wisdom can produce something totally metaphysical, can produce the energy of the creation. But with this understanding, we then understand that the mind can in fact be separate, and try to link back into the mind that is in fact the essence of the universe. And when the Torah tells us that we are the Tselem Elohim, the image of God, the shadow of God, as it were, it's telling us something quite extraordinary, that in fact the entire world is an expression of this mind. And Plato said it very well. If I can find a quick quote from Plato, somewhere I quote him, I know. It says, I should have marked this before I did this. Plato likened our perception of life to persons viewing shadows on a wall while unaware that a far greater reality was producing those shadows, those two-dimensional images. 300 years earlier, the prophet Isaiah had laid the basis for Plato's analogy. This is Isaiah, chapter 35. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwelled in the land of images, upon them the light has shone. What scientists have shown us is not just that the mind is the essence, but that in fact we are the idea of the Creator, and that we are, in fact, every one of us, embodied in the light of creation. And we're an expression of that. And that light of the creation, in turn, is an expression of a wisdom that pervades all existence. All existence is a manifestation of this manifest wisdom or mind or idea, and our minds try to link into it. The chapter that we live in today is a chapter that's dressed in a body, and that's how we contact the mind. But there are other chapters that go on that are not couched within a body, and that's what we call life after death. How does life begin? Was that the question? Looks like this. The difficulty with understanding the origin of life is that we don't understand the origin of life. The life starts immediately on Earth. There had once been a theory. In fact, Wald, the person that mentioned about the eyes, etc., in his early writings, talks how billions of years went by between the origin of water on Earth and the origin of life. That was the catechism that was taught in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s. And then Elso Barshun at Harvard made a tremendous breakthrough. He realized that we're looking for fossils with our eyes, which is ridiculous. The first fossils will be microscopic. And so he used a scanning electron microscope to study slabs of the oldest rocks that could bear fossils. They date back to the origin of water on Earth. The oldest rocks that can bear fossils already have fossils in them, not of people sleeping through lectures, of microbes, bacteria, and the like, undergoing mitosis, cell division. Nature invents cell division in a snap. The first forms of life it's a mistake. It's singular, the first form of life. There's only one game on the block. All of life has a common origin. All of life, once you get to bacteria, you've solved essentially 99% of all forms or problems of life. Life, the first molecule that eventually leads to the first cell, because that's what has to happen. You get rocks and water, and it happens in geology, they overlap. Water and life overlap. So, I mean, you can't date back 3.5 billion years so exactly, but we're talking about life starting about 3.6 to 3.8 billion years ago, with a B, 1,000 million years ago. The first molecules in this liquid or whatever that you're talking about had to discover, chance upon, random reactions, however you want to say it, had to invent the ability to reproduce itself, and to reproduce itself with mutations. Reproduction without mutations is zero, it's stasis. The first molecule, and it's always brushed aside, when you talk about intelligent design arguments in the schools, they always start, and also as argued in the courts, They make it a God-based, they said it was God-based because of the way it's phrased. But the fact is there are basic problems. The first molecules had to invent reproduction. First, it would be reproduction on a molecular level, and that would gradually, I guess, somehow, we have no idea how, become a cell. But nature had to invent it in a snap because it invents cellular life in a geological snap, including mitosis. If you want to see a mind-boggling piece of ballet on a molecular level that makes Nureyev look like he had 2 left feet, the famous Russian male ballet dancer, just study the development of how a cell, just study the progress of a cell undergoing mitosis, cell division. It is a ballet that is so complex, it's hard to believe that even a billion, the miracle isn't if it took 6 days, 6 billion years, or 6 gazillion years. The miracle is it happened. And how it happened, I don't think there is I know there's no answer at the moment. But the likelihood of being found by random reactions, I would say, is about 0. And always, when you read now origin of life speculations, they always have a caveat. This was present, that forced it happened, this, but randomness is out. When God created the when doesn't work, but when God created the heavens and the earth, does heavens mean wisdom or energy? That's a good point. There are, taking from ancient commentary, Talmudic commentary primarily, the heavens are thought, the heavens and the earth is like a chapter heading. God creates the universe, the raw materials for the whole universe. God creates the heavens and the earth. The only other 2 times that the word creation is used in Genesis chapter 1. That's why it's important not to learn the original language if you're going to get into the arguments with it. The only 2 creations that occur on day number 5, when God lists a bunch of animals that are created, and there the commentaries say, it's interesting commentary by by Nachmanides in the year 1250, who said he gets it from his teachers, Nachmanides with an N. He says, why does the Bible say created these animals when everyone knows? This is a commentary about 1,000 years ago. When everyone knows there's only one physical creation, well, NASA confirms that, there's only one physical creation, we call it the Big Bang today. So why does it say the Bible created the animals, and then on day number 7, on day number 6, God created Et Adam, the Adam, with a D, Adam? Because those creations are spiritual. The creation on day number 5 is the nephesh, the soul of animal life. All animals have a nephesh. The Hebrew word is nephesh. It's the soul that the human animal has it also. It's what lets you cut in line, let you cheat in the supermarket, let you run through a red light. That's the nephesh speaking. I got to get to work in time, so what if a kid is crossing the light? He'll jump out of the way, I hope. If not, that's his trouble. That's the nephesh speaking. The neshama, which is created on day number 6, says, you jerk, act like a human being. You're not an animal. You're an animal that's also a human. The nephesh knows the meaning of, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, and it's also Mark for the non-Jews in the group. Mark and Matthew are quoted in Mark and Matthew when the disciples say, what's the most important sentence ever made? And guess what Jesus answers? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Deuteronomy 6, 4. Chapter 6, verse 4, that tells you there's one God, but it tells you something much bigger than that. That's a simple reading. There's one God. The deeper meaning is a oneness that pervades the universe. Now, physics discovers that there is a oneness. The physical oneness of the world, there is a oneness that pervades the entire universe. This oneness that everything is made from the same stuff. We have been in this universe for 15 billion years, or 14 billion, what numbers you're using. For 14 billion years ago, the stuff that makes up you and the chair you're sitting on and everything you see around you enters this universe, and it goes through this chain. This is not as observers. We were part of the first matter that forms. We were part of the stars in which elements were made, but we were part of the stardust. The stars exploded, and 5 billion years ago, we were stardust, and so is everything else you see around you. And by 3.5 billion years ago, we were primordial forms of life. Those things happened. We didn't see them as observers. We were part of them. What drove that is difficult when you look at some of the numbers. But that's it, and we were part of it. And the most extraordinary part of this, I think, is that the fact that we're together, not just in the room, but let's say on the scale of the solar system. We have been neighbors for 15 billion years. The stuff, the radiation that became the particles of matter, the particles of matter that became us, have been in the same part of the universe for 15 billion years. Because if they'd gone off in another direction, they'd be light beams or dust particles out in space by Andromeda or M31 or some other galaxy. But the fact is, It's quite I find it extraordinary. The people, gee, you look familiar. Do I remember those light beams? Yeah, about 15 billion. And somehow it may very well be this Jungian concept of a communal memory. And maybe Gilgul as well as also, but I'll leave that aside. This communal memory, I think in us all is this entire sequence. At some level of understanding, it's so deep that we don't get it. So the idea, I got attracted, but the idea that Genesis chapter 1, God creates the heavens and the earth. There are two levels of understanding that. First of all, we know it's a chapter heading, because the next sentence says there's no earth. Right? The earth was unformed and void, so there wasn't an earth being made. Notice also the heavens are mentioned before the earth, which means the Bible never claimed the earth was the center of the solar system. That's some off-the-wall theologians that want to lock the earth into a position that it never was given. Whether it's the center of the universe or not, every child thinks that he or she is the center of the universe also. So, you got a lot of centers there. The fact is that the Torah never made that claim that we are the center of the universe. Never. It says God created the heavens and the earth after that. But that's the simple meaning, and the esoteric meaning is that the word heavens is the spiritual aspects of the world, and the earth is the material aspects of the world, not just the earth, but all. So that there are two understandings of which I am aware of the heavens. But the creations of the heavens and the earth is on this side of the universe, and the heavens would start off here, and somewhere about here in this flow line, we get to the earth. That would be about here in this flow from the creation till today, about here. That we would get the earth. The heavens would be immediate, and they eventually evolve into the earth. Are there scientific studies, as you're saying, of the metaphysical? That's not quite an oxymoron, but it's impossible. You can't study the metaphysical through the physical. Every person that thinks is locked. You can be the most clever scientist, the most clever theologian, the most clever guru, the most clever whatever you want to be clever in, philosopher, poet, and you still think in a box. And that box is made up of time, space, and matter. Every thought that you have, every thought, with no exception, is based in concepts of time, space, and matter. You can't get out of the box. You're just locked in. So the metaphysical, so there are things in this universe that we can measure interactions of the metaphysical and the physical. That's why the remote control works. There's an exact answer. When you go out and you want to open your car and you press it, you say, wow, the metaphysical really exists. Because that's why it works. Otherwise, and it's not just the radiation, because the radiation isn't metaphysical. But the interaction of or the action of the transistor system that makes it work, that is metaphysical. By metaphysical, I mean quantum in nature, which is illogical, which means it doesn't fit between here and here. Human logic doesn't make sense of it, but it works. We know that it works because you got thousands of persons doing magnificent things with it that allow us to study the world. But it is the logic of how it works can be explained, but it wasn't understood by deduction. It was understood by observation. Logic allows us to understand things by deduction, hence the laws of relativity were deduced, not observed, and then observed to be true. You could someone answered the question about Alzheimer's or amnesia. That would be if part of the brain gets destroyed, like part of the radio gets destroyed, you can't get the information any longer, okay? The brain does store memory. The brain does store emotions, but if that part of the brain is destroyed, you're also not... The Phineas Gage that had that piece of steel that went through his brain and it changed his personality completely. Part of the brain was destroyed. It's just like in the analogy with the radio. If you break part, you mess up part of the tuning system, so you can only get certain wavelengths and not other wavelengths. The brain certainly has a physical reality, and when that part is destroyed, you can't. Some aspects of the mind might not be able to be accessed. So in Torah, which verse or verses relate to the world to come after death? If so, what is the scientific relationship? In the Torah, there is no mention of life after death. Okay? But there is that deep mention of, and time and again we see this, of all the deaths that the person dies. So the quote that I had from Genesis chapters 49 and 50, that Jacob dies, but it's also the same for Esau and the same for who else were the others that were mentioned? Abraham died and gathered to his people and then buried. So the hint of life after death, if that is a hint, you can take it as a hint or not, is that persons die or gather to their people and then are buried. If the gathering to the people is exactly what we see in near-death experiences, then that's the reality. So the Torah does not mention reincarnation, and it doesn't mention life. It doesn't mention life after death explicitly, but has this level, if it is a level of hinting at it, namely the sequence: death, gathered to the person, and then what happens to the physical body is almost inconsequential as far as that gathering to the people, because it happens so much after. So that would be the hint of life after death. The only scientific explanation for that would be with these studies of persons who have near-death experiences, where you have this. And I think the essence of it is that, well, it's simple to say